Well, good evening, and welcome to the ultimate or climactic Ian Ramsey Centre seminar for Michaelmas Term 2018 at the Faculty of Theology and Religion here at the University of Oxford. This project, this seminar is being co-sponsored by the project Evolution, Ethics and Human Origins. I'm going to now invite Dr. Helen Cruz to introduce our main speaker. Thank you.
We are very pleased to invite Sarah Brosnan, who is Professor of Psychology, Philosophy and Neuroscience at Georgia State University, and she also holds a visiting professor position at Michaela E. Keeling for Comparative Medicine and Research, MD Anderson Cancer Center. So her specialty is the evolution of decision-making behavior using an experimental economic approach to compare responses across multiple species, primarily non-human primates, as we'll see a lot today, human adults and children. And a major focus of her work is how individuals decide in what situations and with whom to cooperate, particularly in situations where they receive a different outcome from a social partner. And she's a fellow of the APA and ESP and has got lots of grants with various foundations, NSF, NIH, and Templeton, and papers in Nature Science, PNAS, Current Biology, among other things. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. So thank you, Helen. It's great to be here today. First, I'm going to apologize. I've been in Europe for a week and I've picked up a cold, so hopefully you can hear me. The other thing is that this is a bit less of an empirical talk than I would give to a group of scientists, which is fun. So I'm going to talk lots and lots about my research, try and provide a bit more background on how we actually do the research. So I'll provide a bit of methodology as well, and talk about some of the rationales for doing comparative research, and then also get to speculate on what that means for understanding morality. So, and all these pictures, by the way, are pictures of chimpanzees and capuchin monkeys of mine. So humans have a strong sense of morality. I probably don't have to tell y'all that. This is an example of the so-called Cajun Navy in the US. So if you're not familiar with that, it's a group of people. It started in Louisiana, hence the Cajun part. And whenever there's a natural disaster involving water, which happens quite a lot on the Gulf Coast of the US, thanks to hurricanes and floods and so forth, they throw their boats behind their trucks and drive to wherever it is, and they help with the rescue and the rebuilding, particularly the rescue. They've driven all over the place. Most recently, they were in actually my state, Georgia, and North Carolina after Hurricane Michael. So the Cajun Navy is interesting because these guys, as a group, we know who they are, although I bet most of you didn't. But individually, we don't know anything about them. So why are they doing this? It doesn't seem to be for reward. They're entirely volunteer. Probably it's for fun, but it doesn't seem to be because they think that they're specifically going to get something out of it. And so one of the questions I'm interested in is when you have situations like that in humans, is this something that's uniquely human, or do we see evidence of it in other species? Not necessarily a Cajun Navy, of course, and I'll talk about how we would study some of these things, but the same sorts of things going on. And anecdotally, the answer is yes. So this is a picture of some chimpanzees of mine. This is Emily. Emily's the alpha female. She has this great piece of food. And this is Punch, who's the beta male. And this is the alpha male, Marcus, who's busy trying to take it from her. So what you can't see from this photograph, and we'll see later on, is that Punch comes in and helps her out, and she gets to keep her food. So this looks anecdotally like the sort of situation that in humans, at least, we would say that there's some basic sense of moral behavior. Marcus shouldn't be taking Emily's food. It was hers. And in fact, Punch is coming in to help. And there are other examples. There's some fantastic writings by Frans de Waal. He's a Dutch ethologist who was also my graduate advisor. And he tells, for instance, of a story of an older female who was trying very hard to get a tire off of a pole because it had some water inside it that she wanted. She gave up and walked away. And later, one of the young males in the group came back, lifted the tire off carefully, and took it to her. So it's an anecdote, but it certainly looks like it could be related to the same sorts of behaviors we see in humans. And of course, this is not new. So this is a long passage you don't need to read from Charles Darwin. But the major point of it is, this is in his book, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, which is much less well known than The Origin of Species, but probably should be better known. It's where he allows himself to expand on what evolution means for humans. And he says essentially that if you've got a species that's social, once it gets smart enough, it's going to get a moral sense or a conscience, which he defines as taking pleasure in the society of your fellows, feeling a certain amount of sympathy for them. And I should point out that in 1859, sympathy really meant what we call empathy today, and to perform various services for them. So these are the sorts of things that we can look at in other species and that anecdotally seem to be there. And I put this quote up mostly to point out that despite the fact that you probably haven't heard much discussion of this as an idea, it actually goes back quite far, 150 years. It's just that we didn't talk about it much in the intervening century. So there is a big problem, though. You can't just go up and ask another species why they did something. So it's very difficult to study things like social ideals in nonverbal species. It doesn't mean they don't have them, but it means that we can't use a lot of the same methodologies that we use for humans. So in order to study it, what we do is we try to break these larger things like moral behavior down into smaller components that are tractable for empirical work. So rather than addressing morality, which is almost impossible to design an experiment for, you figure out what's related to morality that you can test. So essentially, you study the components of moral behavior rather than studying moral behavior in and of itself, and hope that eventually, when you study enough of these, you can use that to tell you something about the larger story. So this is not exactly one paper or one dissertation project, but when you combine enough research from many different people, you begin to get there. So today, I'm going to talk about two different components that I see. The first is behaviors that contribute to social regularity. So one of the things that many of us who are biologists argue is that at heart, morality is about social regularity. It's about making sure that individuals are working together in a way that benefits them all. So actually, it's surprisingly uncommon to have social species because if you're living in a social group, there are benefits, sure, but there are also costs. You're competing with other individuals for mates, you're competing with them for food, you're competing with them for dominance, which is just a proxy for mates and food, you're competing with them to be in the center of a group away from predators or to have first access to the thing you predated upon, and so forth. So you can only live socially if the benefits to being in that social group outweigh the cost, at least on average. If you're the lowest ranking one, that might not be the case. So we can look at some behaviors that contribute to social regularity in other species and see if they're the sorts of things we see in humans as well. We can also look at precursors to specific moral behaviors, and that's where I'll spend the majority of this talk. My research, as Helen said, I use experimental economic paradigms to look at decision making, and two areas that I'm particularly interested in are cooperation and inequity. And I'm going to talk about some of those experiments today. But before I do, I wanted to give you a quick summary of what I think the comparative approach can actually tell us about the evolution of moral behavior. So first of all, it can tell us about the biological foundations and constraints of moral behavior. So Mel Konner, who's an anthropologist, wrote a book, The Tangled Wing, that describes this perhaps best. He argues that understanding human behavior is like understanding a bird that's been trapped in a briar patch. There are, in principle at least, many different ways that that bird could get out, but in reality, there are only a few possible pathways, and our job is to try and figure out what those possible pathways were and which one was actually followed. So by studying other species, we may recognize which pathways are more or less likely, and by better understanding those pathways, we better understand why the human sense of morality might have evolved. We can also look for the mechanisms and development of these behaviors. So not just what do we have, but how do they develop? What's the role of culture? What's the role of not only just human culture, but specific cultures? Are they variable and so forth? I'm not talking about that in this talk, although I think there are a number of other people later in the year who are going to be doing so. But you can also look at things like mechanisms, neural mechanisms, endocrinological mechanisms, and so forth. You can also better understand the selective pressures that led to these specific behaviors. So that's tied into this first idea of the biological foundations and constraints. But by comparing across multiple different species, you can look for environments that they shared in common or contexts that they shared in common and try to understand why this evolved. I mean, it makes sense looking at it from this end. Of course, if you're going to live in a group, you have to figure out how to negotiate the costs and benefits of a group. But how did they do that? What were the specific contexts that made that more beneficial than continuing to live alone? And finally, potentially a functional explanation for why moral behavior evolved. Again, of course, it seems very obvious from this end, but it'd be nice to know, especially for specific components, why they were so useful. I do want to give you two brief segues into evolutionary biology, long enough to clarify a couple of terms. First is function versus mechanism, which I think is probably the most misunderstood set of terms in evolutionary biology, including by biologists. So when we talk about function versus mechanism, we're talking about two different ways that the same behavior can manifest. So this goes back to Tinbergen's 4 questions, if you remember your introductory behavior class in college, if you had one. And the idea is that behavior can be described on multiple different levels. One is the function. So this is what does this behavior do? Why did it evolve? What was its evolutionary history? So this is really the level of what the species is doing, or the individuals in the species are doing. The second one is mechanism. So mechanism is how they do it. So what are the endocrine mechanisms, the various hormones that go into it? What's the neuroscience behind it? What are the cognitive mechanisms that are necessary? What are the developmental pathways? What are the cultural constraints, and so forth? And it's important to keep these separated because mechanism does not imply function or the reverse. So especially, I'm going to use my favorite example with the case of altruistic behavior. So if I tell you that this chimpanzee brought a tire over to the older female chimpanzee and handed her the tire of water, functionally, that is an altruistic act. From a functional perspective, he expended energy that gave her a benefit for what doesn't appear to at least be a short-term benefit. From a mechanism perspective, though, we have no idea if it was actually altruistic. So altruism would, if you say that something was altruistic when you're talking about humans, we usually meant that the person wanted to. They intended to go help somebody else and actually wished to do so. We have no idea if that male wished to do so or not. So it's very, very important to keep these separate and not assume that just because behavior looks similar, that they're underpinned by the same common mechanisms. Sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't. For the vast majority of this talk, I'm going to be sitting purely on the functional side. We're still at the stage where we're looking for what are these behaviors that we share in common. And bear in mind that that doesn't necessarily mean that they have the same underlying mechanisms. In a few cases they may, but I will tell you if they do. The second thing I wanted to briefly discuss is the comparative method. So when we talk about comparing multiple species, there are really two ways that this can happen. And I think it's not commonly recognized that there are two. So they're homology and convergence. So here's my little fake family tree. So it's rooted down here with species C that's split into two species that shared trait A, and then so forth. So these are essentially multiple generations. So there are two ways that species can come to share traits. The first, and the one that people tend to talk about the most, is homology. So these 6 species all share trait A through homology. That means that they have a common ancestor with trait A and that they inherited it from them. So for instance, hawks and bluebirds share the trait of winged flight through homology, through a common ancestor, because the common ancestor to birds had winged flight. However, you can also get shared traits through convergence. And convergence is when two species or groups of species, share a common trait, but they share it because of similar selection pressures and not because of a shared common ancestor. So in this case, this guy over here has trait A, let's say winged flight again, but the common ancestor between him and this group of species did not have winged flight. So this could be, for instance, your bumblebees or your bats. Both of them have winged flight, but they're using very different mechanisms and they evolved it separately. And this is important because when you look at homology, generally speaking, what people are trying to figure out is how far back did a trait go? So is this something we share with great apes? Is this something we share with old world monkeys? Is this something we share with new world monkeys? Is this something we share more broadly with the mammals, and so forth? And that is very useful. But so is convergence. So convergence, for instance, could tell us that bumblebees and birds, or at least the precursor bird, shared some sort of selective pressure, presumably for escaping predation or accessing resources that couldn't otherwise be accessed, that's selected for winged flight. And so similarly, if you see shared behaviors, say cooperation, between two groups that don't have a common ancestor that cooperates, here I'm thinking of corvids like ravens and then primates, then you would start looking for shared selective pressures. I actually think convergence can be particularly important because it focuses on what are the shared features and not just, oh, okay, let's see if this is how far back in this lineage it goes. All that being said, most of my talk is going to focus on homology because I only have 45 minutes, and so I'm going to stick to the primates. But I like to put this in here to remind you that it is important to look beyond primates. Just because we're primates doesn't mean we can't learn a lot by studying other species. Oh, and just to complete your evolutionary education, you also see divergence sometimes, which is when a species within the same taxon develops a different trait through different selective pressures. So if we go back to our bird example, this could be penguins. They still have wings, but they use them to swim because in their environment, that is far more useful than flight. So on to the empirical meat of the talk. I'm going to start by briefly talking about some of these behaviors that can contribute to social regularity and give you some examples from the non-human primates, although I'm not going to go into much detail. One is that non-human primates and other species seem to have social norms. So for instance, non-human primates, chimpanzees in particular, seem to have a norm of how much punishment is appropriate. So there are numerous anecdotes of situations when someone gets in trouble. Often it's a juvenile male who is mating with a female when the alpha female was a bit too close. And the alpha female responds with aggression. And if it goes on for too long, other members of the group will gang up and stop the alpha male. This certainly looks like a social norm. Again, we can't go and ask them what it is, but there are numerous anecdotes of these sorts of things. Unfortunately, they're relatively difficult to test experimentally because you can't set up a situation where you're going to get someone in trouble and let them be punished. At least we wouldn't. So we can't look at that in more detail. However, repeatedly this appears. We also see social norms around possession and property. This is back to Emily. This is Punch. He's now come over. She's got her arm around Punch's back, and she is recruiting him. You can see that Punch is just starting to hoot, hoo, 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 and that's a display behavior, and the females behind her are hooting. So again, these three chimpanzees seem to feel that Emily shouldn't have lost her food. Just for the record, Emily didn't share her food with them afterwards, nor is she known for being a great sharer. So this potentially is a good example of a sort of social norm that's based just purely on what you should do. There's also this social norm of possession as 9/10 of the law is actually fairly widespread. So this is another example of chimpanzees eating this is frozen fruit juice, and these are chimps in Texas in August, so frozen fruit juice is particularly popular. This is the lowest ranking female in the group. Her name is Nina, and this is the highest ranking female in the group, Jane, and her daughter Tasha, and they're staring at Nina, and eventually Nina is going to give them the fruit juice, but they don't take it from her. So there seems to be this very strong norm against just reaching out and taking things. That's true in some primates, not in others. So in capuchin monkeys and other species you're going to hear a lot about today, they also have what we call the possession as 9/10 of the law norm. So individuals who manage to get something can usually hang on to it. Rhesus macaques, on the other hand, do not. So rhesus macaques have these specialized structures called cheek pouches that they can store food in, and I have seen dominants reach in and pull food out of cheek pouches. So even getting it halfway down isn't quite good enough. I should also mention that these guys seem to be aware of this norm. So if I had thrown food in between these three, Nina would have never reached for it. She would have sat there or even taken a step back. So they do seem to understand what's going to be the result of this. I one time watched an alpha male follow a juvenile around the group for probably 10 minutes, and the juvenile would run somewhere and frantically eat a little bit of food, and then the male would get there and stare at him, and he'd run somewhere else and eat a little bit of food, and eventually the child dropped it. But the alpha male never took it from him. We also see an enormous amount of reciprocity, typically in the exchange of favors. So grooming, support, males will groom females for sex and so forth. We do see some in terms of material goods too, although there aren't that many material goods that individuals can share back and forth. It's one of the weaknesses of a lot of our experimental studies is that in order to give them very quantified cost and benefits that we can measure, we use food, but most of their sorts of social behaviors in the wild probably involve services, not food. And there's not much we can do about that. But it's something that's important to keep in mind. Both in the wild and in captivity, these guys show strong reciprocity. What they don't show particularly strongly is the sort of calculated reciprocity that you and your credit card company use, where you borrow from them, £3.20, and then you owe that back to them at the end of the month. They tend to use a more generalized reciprocity, probably either based on symmetrical features of the relationship. So you are best friends or mother offspring, or in humans' cases, roommates, so you spend a lot of time together. So just by default, if you do nice things, it's probably going to benefit the other person, and the nice things they do will benefit you. Or what Frans de Waal and I have called attitudinal reciprocity, which is that you do something nice for me, I feel good about you, so I'm much more likely to do something nice back to you. So that would be contingent. It's very specific, but not necessarily calculated. So when you do studies where you say, okay, we gave you 4 pieces of apple and you shared 2 of them with John over here, and then we gave John 4 grapes, did he share 2 back with you? You don't get this sort of directed reciprocity in the short term. But if you look at their relationships over a longer term, you see very strong reciprocity, and you see it within specific relationships. So it's not that everybody's reciprocal with everybody else in the group. They have very strong, what we would call friendships, and these are the individuals they tend to trade with. So again, this would seem to be something that's really important for understanding the sort of social regularity. So moving on to my favorite research topic, we also have precursors of specific moral behaviors. So I'm just going to run through a few of those. One is prosocial behavior. So prosocial behavior you can think of as altruism light. It essentially means that you help someone else but is agnostic into whether or not you paid a cost. So specifically in a psychology perspective, altruism means I benefit you at a cost to me. And in this case, we're just interested in whether or not individuals will make decisions to benefit others. It certainly looks like they do and when we do observations of them, but we don't know that for sure. So this has been studied widely. The standard paradigm looks something like this. You have 2 primates who are sitting next to each other, usually paying about that much attention to each other, and you give one of them a choice between choosing an outcome that provides an equal benefit to both them and their partner, and between choosing an outcome that just benefits them. So all 3 of these would be equal, so there is no cost to the chooser here for choosing either the prosocial option or the so-called selfish option, and we see what they choose. Generally speaking, you want to do this twice, one with the partner there and one with the partner absent, and you consider an individual to be prosocial if they choose the prosocial option more often when the partner is present than when the partner is absent. That would indicate that they're paying attention to the presence of the partner, and then they're choosing that outcome accordingly. And you don't have to read this slide, but if you look at the results, they are all over the map. And I have been part of many of these studies that were all over the map. So capuchins do most of the time, but not all the time. Chimpanzees don't sometimes, but do other times, and so forth. And what seems to be the case is that they are, in fact, willing to make prosocial options. But here is another important point for interpreting these experimental work. We don't always put them in a situation where they appear to care. So one of the things we often forget when we run these studies with other species is that we design a study that we think makes a ton of sense and plop it in front of another species and assume that they're going to interpret it in the same way. Any of you who've ever worked with kids know that just because you intended something to be fun or you intended them to understand this doesn't mean that they will. And the same thing is even more true when you're looking across species. So, for instance, in the first study that was run on this sort of procedure, which I was actually the postdoc on, we found no evidence of prosocial behavior. Later, another postdoc went back and reran the same study, got the same results. None of the chimpanzees showed any prosocial behavior whatsoever. And then he did something a little bit different. So he gave the chimpanzees who had been the chooser the opportunity to be the recipient with a chooser who was a stooge, had been trained to always choose the prosocial option. Then put them back in the role of the chooser with the original partner. So there was no chance for reciprocity, and suddenly they were all picking prosocially. So it appeared that maybe they just didn't understand what was going on. There was another study recently out of Leipzig where they did something similar, except In this case, in order for the chooser to make a choice, the first individual had to do something as well. And if the first individual did something that was costly, so if the first individual gave up a food reward in order to give the partner a choice, they were more prosocial. If the first individual did something but it wasn't costly, or if the experimenter came in and moved the apparatus in the same way, they weren't prosocial. So they may actually be quite a bit more sensitive to the contingencies of the task than we recognize. And when we put something in front of them that we see as, oh, you should choose prosocially, they see it as really idiotic, and so they're not choosing that way. So it's important, I think, to look at the whole corpus of data and not just at one particular study, whether it supports our hypothesis or not, because we better understand it when we look more broadly across all of these different studies and figure out what are the contexts that are changing their behavior. I've also been very interested in studying inequity. So in humans, inequity has been argued to be a very strong factor that influences cooperation. Essentially, economists and psychologists have both argued that inequity is a way for individuals to recognize when they're with a bad partner. So if you and I are working together and you keep taking more of the rewards, it's time for me to go find somebody else to work with because I'm not benefiting from you. And so nobody had ever tested this in non-human primates. So I started this work actually almost 20 years ago now when I was a graduate student, and we came up with a very, very simple design. So we wanted to see how subjects would respond when they got the different reward for their partner for doing the same task. So we had 3 conditions. We've since had probably 15 conditions, and I'm not going to bore you with them, but you can come ask me afterwards if you're interested. And in the basic condition, we had an equity condition where there was a subject and a partner sitting next to one another, and I'm about to show you a video clip of what this looks like, and both of them would trade a token back to the human experimenter, and they would get a piece of cucumber, a quarter of a slice of cucumber. So capuchin monkeys like cucumber. If you walk in and hand them cucumber, they are more than happy to eat them. Then we had an inequity test where the subject continued to trade for cucumber, but on every other trial, when it was the partner's turn, the partner would trade and get a grape. And capuchin monkeys like grapes quite a bit better than capuchin monkeys like cucumbers, which I actually find funny because I like cucumbers better. But I can promise you that the higher the sugar content and the more expensive it is at the grocery store, the more a capuchin monkey likes something. So grapes were definitely preferred. We do that, in case you're interested, by walking up to the subjects and holding out one of each, seeing which one they pick. Doing it again, you repeat that 10 times on 2 different days. Basically, every capuchin chooses grapes 10 out of 10 times on both days. Occasionally, you get one who only does it 9 out of 10 times. Usually, that's the first trial. So what we're interested in here is how does the subject respond to their cucumber when the partner does the same task for the same reward versus when the partner does the same task but gets a better reward. There's one more control, however, that's essential. One of the big differences between these two is, despite the fact that in most studies there are bowls of grapes and bowls of cucumbers sitting out there, in this study we're continually drawing the subject's attention to the grape because we keep picking it up and giving it to their partner. And so that could lead to what's called a contrast effect. Simply, I see something in the environment and therefore I want it, but it's not because you have it, it's just because I see it there. So essentially, they're both violations of expectation, but a contrast effect would be a non-social origin and inequity would be social. So we ran a third condition, which we cleverly called the equity plus grape condition. You can think of it as a contrast control, and for this, we would go up to each monkey, we would hold up the grape until they gestured towards it. When they gestured towards it, we'd put it back in the bowl and have them trade and give them a cucumber. And then we'd go do the same with their partner. So it's exactly the same for each subject, and they both end up with a cucumber, but we're drawing their attention to the grape. As a matter of fact, we're actually drawing their attention to the grape twice as often because we wanted to make sure that the conditions between the subject and partner were identical. So before I show you the data, I want to show you a little video clip of what this looks like. These are 2 female capuchin monkeys. This one's named Winter and this one's named Lance. And so Lance is going to trade, and she's going to get a piece of cucumber, which she's going to eat. Then we're going to go over to Winter. Winter's going to trade and get some grape, and then back to Lance. So, is it going to play? Excellent. So here you see Lance. She's trading. Notice she eats her cucumber there. So what that was, Winter just gave the grape skin back to Malini, who is the experimenter, because capuchins are picky and do not like grape skin. So you can see that Lance definitely noticed that Winter got a grape. She trades, gets her cucumber, takes a bite, She doesn't seem particularly thrilled with it. So in our study, that actually counted as accepting the cucumber because she took a bite of it before she threw it away. But you can see that subjectively her behavior looks quite different. We're actually going through and recoding all those videotapes right now to see if there are differences in behavior. So again, Winter has gotten her grape. Lance takes it. In full disclosure, most capuchins cannot do aimed overhand throwing. Just actually all the offspring in this family, their mom's name is Lulu, and apparently all of them can throw, so who knew? But the rest of them will just push it out or refuse to take it. So if you look across studies, and this is summarizing about 3 studies that have been done on this, what you find is these guys all, I forgot to mention this, these guys all come from the same social group. So all of the capuchins and chimpanzees I'm testing come from stable long-term social groups that have both males and females in them. So we only use subjects from essentially ethologically appropriate groups. These are groups like you would find in the wild. They all live in big outdoor enclosures because I do my research in Georgia and Texas and it's quite warm there. So you can leave them outside all of the time. They come inside for testing, but we're testing them with members of these groups. So most of these guys grew up with the subjects they're being tested with, excluding some of the males because we have to switch males around eventually because of reproductive reasons. And in both species, and in capuchins in particular, the males would be the ones who would come and go. In chimpanzees, we try to do the best we can. It's usually females who move in chimpanzees. So what we see is that they refuse about 10% of the trials no matter what. This is because they are being called in from their social group, and if something happens outside, they are distracted. If they hear a male mating or a hawk flies overhead and they give an alarm call or whatnot, we'll get some level of distraction. But you can see that about twice as often they refuse the cucumber in this inequity condition as compared to both the equity and the equity plus grape condition. So having a grape waved in their face doesn't seem to throw them off, but having their partner get a grape that didn't get waved in their face most definitely does. One of the things that we've been interested in is the fact that you do see some variability in this response across studies. There are probably a lot of reasons for this. One reason is probably related to personality, and I'll get to that in a minute with chimpanzees. One is probably related to background and history. Not all of the primates who are being tested come from stable social groups in the same way that ours do. I've been working with the same capuchins since I was a graduate student, so I took them with me to Georgia State, and I've been working with the same chimpanzees as long too. So we know these groups are stable. The other thing is probably food preferences. So everybody food preferences their animals, but we all use different foods. And so it may be that if I'm choosing a food that they really like is the low value and really, really like is the high value, there's not as big a response. This is roughly the equivalent to what you hear when we talk about human data, when you talk about how individuals respond, for instance, to prisoner's dilemma or ultimatum games. Does it make a difference if you're just having someone play for 50 cents versus if you're having, or 50 pence, versus if you have somebody playing for, say, 100 pounds? That makes an enormous difference, and people might be less likely to refuse something if it's still absolutely a very large amount of money. So to test that, we reran this with 3 different reward conditions. We got a low, medium, and high value food. So we compared how they responded when they got a low and their partner got a medium, when they got a low and their partner got a high, and when they got a medium and their partner got a high. So the idea is to see whether whether they just respond all the time no matter what, or whether what's driving their response is if they get a particularly low value food, if their partner gets a particularly high value food, which would be yellow and blue here, or if there's a large difference in the relative value, which would be yellow here. And what you see from these results with the capuchins is that it clearly seems to be if you get a relatively low value food and your partner gets something better, doesn't matter if it's medium or high value, you're going to refuse. You never refuse, interestingly, if you get this medium value food. So for this, we used cucumbers as the low value food again. We used pieces of apple as the medium value food, and we used grapes as the high value food. And in all of these pairings, they preferred the medium over the low at least 80% of the time on 2 separate days, and they preferred the high over the medium, and that was true for every subject we tested, so it wasn't just on average. So it's clearly you're only going to refuse in an equitable situation if you're getting something relatively low, which makes sense. If I'm irritated, I might refuse 50 cents or $1, but I'm probably not going to turn down $100 or 100 pounds no matter how irritated I am, because that's a lot of money. so I might accept it and protest in some different way. We're actually going back now, and I don't have data on this because it's still very preliminary, but we're going back through and coding all of our videotapes to look for changes in behavior. So are they doing more of that shaking you saw? Are they doing more banging? Are they doing the thing where they take a bite and then throw it out so they don't completely eat it, and so forth, for those inequity trials where they still took the reward, so ignoring the trials where they refused, so ignoring these trials up here. And what we're seeing in preliminary results is they are, in fact, substantially more agitated and showing more frustration behaviors in the trials where their partner's getting a better food than them, even when they don't refuse, which might indicate that down here they're still upset, just not upset enough to give up that piece of apple. We've also replicated this on groups of chimpanzees, so we've tested it now on, I think, 6 or 8 different groups of chimpanzees. These are examples of some of my chimp groups out in Texas. And the first few sets of results were hard to reconcile with one another. We ran a study first in 2005 and found that there was a really big difference between social groups, which was fascinating. So groups that had been together for a very long period of time showed no response to inequity, and the other social group did show a strong response to inequity. And this matches what you see in humans, where individuals who have better relationships with one another tend to not respond to inequity, or at least not as strongly as individuals who don't have strong relationships with one another. So you're much happier when your spouse or your best friend has some happy surprise than you are when the person you barely know down the hall does so. However, that study had a problem because the group that had these strong social relationships had also been living together for quite a bit longer. So they also had more normal social relationships. So we replicated it on 6 groups of chimpanzees out in Texas who had all been, did this in 2008, and all of these chimpanzee groups had been living in stable social groups since the early 70s. So they were either in a stable group or had been born into that stable group for the last 20 or 30 years. We replicated it there, found no evidence that there was any effect of relationship quality, but we did find that males were responding more strongly than females. So we didn't know what to do with that. So we finally gave up and took 4 of these social groups, and we ran a study where we tried to test every single chimpanzee with every other chimpanzee in their social group. The idea being we can really try to drill down in what's going on. Our hypothesis was that it was relationship-based, that individuals who had strong relationships were not going to respond strongly to inequity, and strong relationships were defined as individuals who spent a lot of time grooming and sitting in proximity and contact. Both of those are known social behavior, positive affiliative social behaviors. We do observations on all the groups we work with multiple times per week, and so we have separately collected data where we can look at these questions. So the first thing that happened was all of our testing is voluntary. So our guys are never restricted from anything, food, water, social access, going outside or whatnot to come in, so they have to come in entirely because they want to. And it turned out that 45% of our possible pairings had no interest in coming inside together. So all but one of the chimpanzees we tested, it was about 55 chimpanzees, were willing to come inside and test, just not with everybody. So we had a whole big set of criteria for how to determine that they refused to come in. If you go, that I won't bore you with, but I can tell you later if you're interested. So if you go back and look at who was willing to come in together, the individuals who had strong relationships were more than happy to come in and work together. And that tended to coincide very strongly with the individuals who'd been living together for the longest. So we were getting a relationship effect, but it was on whether or not they were willing to come in and test together in the first place. Once we looked just at those 55 pairs, there was no effective relationship quality, but interestingly, we did find what looks like an effect of what's called personality. So there's been this big push in the last 15 or 20 years to look at different personalities in different animals, and personality is essentially a fancy word for saying consistent individual differences in how they respond to a given situation. And so we had some data on these guys that had been collected several years prior by one of my postdocs who had no interest whatsoever in inequity and cooperation, but was interested in these individual differences. So she had collected personality data based on both talking to the keepers and getting them to fill out questionnaires on each of the animals like we do when we're talking about personality in young children, and also based on their behavioral responses to a variety of different situations. So what we found was that there was a correlation between these personality factors and responses. So chimpanzees, who are much more social, which these are the ones who are spending time with other chimpanzees, who are doing more grooming in general, not just with specific partners and so forth, responded more strongly to inequity. Whereas the chimpanzees, who were much more focused on humans, these were the ones who liked to come in and work with humans, were easy to train and so forth, responded more strongly to this contrast condition. So we got a difference here. We don't know what that second group of chimpanzees was doing. Maybe they were more focused on how things ought to be, and they're very structured chimpanzees. Maybe they saw the interaction as being with the human and saw it as an inequitable situation with the human because we're the one they're working with and suddenly we're not giving them the same reward as their partner. But we did get a strong response. We're now replicating that, trying to finally get at this relationship quality question by running the study outside so that the entire social group can come up and participate at any time that they want. And so we have each individual session, we have one individual pegged as the one who either gets more than everybody or less than everybody. So I think we now have like 950 hours worth of sessions that we have to code because it takes forever to run it on a decent number of subjects. But the idea is to try and figure out if we're seeing differences in relationship quality. And if we run enough sessions, sooner or later, almost every possible pair comes up. So one thing that I could write a separate paper on, but I'm just going to mention briefly, is that I'm interested in the function of this response. And remember back at the beginning, I talked about convergence and homology. We've now tested 9 different species in non-human primates. So callitrichids, who are the marmosets and tamarins, owl monkeys, capuchins, squirrel monkeys, several species of macaques. Others have done that as well. And then 3 out of the 4 species have been well tested, and we and another group are working on gorillas. So hopefully we'll have that data soon. And what we find is that not all of these species respond to inequity when you give them this same inequity paradigm. There are a couple of possible hypotheses. It could have been that all primates responded. It could have been that just the great apes responded. It could have been based on brain size, in which case you'd expect the great apes and also capuchin monkeys, who have particularly large brain-to-body ratios, and to respond. It could be based on sociality, in which case you'd expect these 3 great apes, macaques, and most of the New World monkeys to respond. What it seems to most strongly correlate with, however, is how often they cooperate in the wild. So capuchins, macaques, both pan species, the bonobos and the chimpanzees and humans, show very strong responses to inequity and also cooperate in multiple different modalities in the wild with non-kin. Orangutans do not, neither do squirrel monkeys. And we also just ran a study on squirrel monkeys looking at cooperation in captivity, and they don't cooperate in captivity either, even though capuchins and chimpanzees do. So it seems that it is most tightly tied to cooperation. I'm just going to mention the callitrichids and the owl monkeys. They're cooperative breeders, so you would expect them to respond strongly to inequity. So these guys totally violated our hypotheses. In retrospect, though, we think we might have made a bad hypothesis. We tested mated pairs who in most cases had offspring. And we were testing them on a paradigm where they could refuse what was the equivalent of a grape over the equivalent of a cucumber, and they tended not to do it. One very strong possibility is these guys are very interdependent, and it's possible that it wasn't worth irritating their partner over the equivalent of a grape. So one of the things that we'd like to test more is to what degree cooperative breeding and other sorts of interdependency may actually change the calculus so it's no longer worth getting upset about inequity. If I'm right, I would actually hypothesize that these guys should be hypersensitive to it when they're forming that pair bond and then not respond to it particularly often afterwards. Haven't been able to test that, but hopefully soon. I don't have a huge amount of time, but I want to run through a couple more things. We also have looked at some costly cooperation. So this is not just, are we willing to work together in a mutualistic situation where we both pull in and benefit, but what happens if one of us gets more than the other? So one of my favorite studies was done by Franz de Waal and Jason Davis back a long time ago now. And they ran a study with capuchin monkeys where the capuchins had to work together to pull in this tray. And the tray is counterweighted such that I can't pull it in by myself, but if you and I are working together, we can, and there's food on it. And he had 2 conditions, standard and clumped. In both cases, there were 2 slices of apple in each little bowl. But in this standard condition here, the bowls were right next to the bar pole. So when I pull it in, I can just reach out and grab my food. And that's exactly what the monkeys did. In the clumped condition, this bar pole is about this wide, and capuchin monkeys are about the size of house cats. So in this clumped condition, they pull it in, but then they have to let go, it locks into place, and walk into the center and get their food. And so this is a situation where there can be monopolization. So if I am dominant to you and I go into the middle, I can elbow you out of the way and grab the food. So the question was, would they care? Food's still separated into 2 separate cups, so it should make it easy. And what they found was that for both kin right here and non-kin here, they were much more likely to cooperate in the standard condition than they were in the clumped condition. And non-kin barely cooperated at all in the clumped condition, even though it was the same food. And the other interesting thing is they did this from the very first trial. So it appears that these guys brought in knowledge of their social relationships with one another. Remember, they lived together as a group and have their whole lives, and applied it to this novel situation. So they didn't need to practice a couple of times and figure out that the dominant was going to steal their food. They seemed to get it, which to me implies that they have a strong understanding of cooperation and food sharing and how all of these things tie together. It's not something that they're learning fresh every single time. We followed up on this with an experiment that was very similar, except in this case we only used the standard condition, and they either worked for apples in each cup, for a grape in each cup, or an apple in one cup and a grape in the other cup, a slice of apple in one cup and a grape in the other cup. My hypothesis was that they would have the most difficulty with this apple-grape condition because one individual would have to settle for the apple while the other one got a grape, and we knew by then that they didn't like inequity. That's not what we found. They were equally likely to cooperate across all 3 of those conditions. But when we went back and looked post hoc at the data, what we discovered was that about half of our pairs were in this apple-grape condition, what we called inequitable partners. So in the apple-grape condition, in about half of our pairs, the dominant insisted on pulling on the side with the grape every single time. And in about half of our pairs, they split who pulled on the side with the grape about 50-50. If you look at cooperation rates based on their behavior, what you find is that these equitable pairs cooperate at very high rates, that's between 75 and 80%, across all 3 conditions, whereas the inequitable pairs are only cooperating about 30% of the time across all 3 conditions. It doesn't seem to be, oh look, this is a situation where you can take advantage of me, because if that was the case, you would expect these pink bars here to be just as high as the green bars, because those are both equal conditions and they never stole food from each other in any of our bar pull tests in the standard condition. So they had no reason to expect that they would lose food. So it doesn't seem to be, oh, in this particular case, I'm not going to get food. One possible argument is that it is, I don't like you and I'm not working with you. So it could be a generalized response to the partner rather than a very calculated look at the situation. So the last thing I want to talk about is whether or not we really are seeing fairness. So I've talked about all of these circumstances from the perspective of the individual who's getting less. So I get less than you in this case, how do I respond? I have the opportunity for less. Presumably what's happening here is that the subjects who continue to get less are not coming up and pulling anymore. That's the likely underlying mechanism. But what about the individual who's getting more? In humans, we care quite a lot about fairness in the broader sense. So if I always respond when I get less than you but never get worried when I get more than somebody else, you're not going to say I'm a fair person. So one of the things that we need to look at is how they respond to this other context. So essentially what we wanted to do was go back and look at how this guy who's getting the grape all the time responds. Well, we had been looking previously at the cucumber monkey. So we added a condition, which we called equity high value, which was exactly the same except that they traded and they got the high value grape. And what we were interested in was the partner's response this time to the grape when the subject also got a grape versus the partner's response to this grape when the subject got a cucumber. Essentially, it's the reverse logic of the earlier inequity test. Do you notice when you get more than your partner as compared to when you get the same? So the short version of this story is most of the time, no. In most of the species we've tested, there's no difference in the partner's reaction across this. However, chimpanzees do seem to be showing a response. So chimpanzees here are refusing the grape when their partner gets a cucumber about twice as often as they refuse the grape when their partner also gets a grape. And so that's statistically significant. It also appears to be biologically relevant. We have run I was talking earlier about the new study we're running where we're looking at the entire social group and how they respond when the social group is present. Very, very, very early data because we haven't finished coding it all, so I probably shouldn't even be saying this, but very early data indicates that they're actually showing a stronger response to being over-benefited in this larger group situation than they were in these dyads we pulled them out in. There's also data from the ultimatum game in chimpanzees that shows something similar. Chimpanzees, who are the ones who are choosing whether to pick an equal distribution or an unequal distribution, are more likely to choose an equal distribution when their partner is there and has the ability to refuse them, but not when their partner is just sitting there. So it does seem to be contingent. It's not that they're just generally nice individuals, it's that they seem to be focused on what can your partner do. I would also like to point out that this is their response when they're disadvantaged. So they are much more upset by being disadvantaged than by being advantaged. It's funny, depending on what group I talk to, people either go, well, yeah, that makes sense, or people tell me that this is a huge difference because humans would be equally upset by being advantaged and disadvantaged. Lest you're in the latter group, I always like these data from Peter Blake and Katie McAuliffe. These are data on a 1-to-4 distribution of, I think it was stickers, among kids from Canada, India, Mexico, Peru, Senegal, Uganda, and the USA. And it's a cross-sectional study between ages 4 and 15. You can see that in the equal condition, almost nobody refuses, and they refuse even less as time goes on. In the disadvantageous condition, everybody basically refuses, and it skyrockets with age. They can't explain the Mexican kids down here. They do refuse more often. They don't refuse nearly as often as the other kids do. But if you look at how they respond when they're advantaged, only in 3 societies do the kids respond at all by the age of 14 or 15 when they're advantaged. And in those 3 societies, which are Canada, the US, and oddly Uganda, not oddly because Uganda, it's odd that it's Uganda, but odd because of all the groups in here, you would not expect Uganda to be showing the same response. They do show the same response, but it's still lower than their responses to being disadvantaged. So most data shows that it takes kids a fairly long time to get to the point of refusing when they get more than a partner, and that even when they do so in more limited situations. This is just the nicest set of data for it. So Franz de Waal and I have argued that you can use these data to understand something about the evolution of fairness. So where did it come from? How did we get to the point where we really do care about fairness, and we really do care about things like whether or not people on Wall Street are making more money than the rest of us? And so we've argued that in order to understand this, you really need to divide the sense of fairness into 2. The first one we've called first-order fairness, which is basically disadvantageous, how you respond when you're disadvantaged. So you get a grape, I get a cucumber, I get irritated and protest because if I continue to get cucumbers while you get grapes, you show no reaction, and the relationship is probably over. I'm going to go off and try to cooperate with somebody else because presumably if things are bad enough, even if I choose at random, I won't be doing any worse, and I might benefit. Second-order fairness, however, would occur when individual A, you, do have a sense of understanding how I'm going to respond. So I, again, get the lower value reward. I, again, start to protest. But in this case, if you understand that I'm going to protest, you can act to forestall my protest by doing something to equalize the reactions. You can refuse your better reward. Perhaps you share a bit of it with me. You probably don't even need to share all of it. If you're human, perhaps you write a letter to the editor or go participate in a protest, something that makes you feel like you're trying to equalize things. And if you do it right, then my protest should go away and we can maintain our relationship. Now, on the short term, that makes no sense for you because now you're paying a cost. You're paying a time cost to participate in that protest, or you're paying an actual fiscal cost to share some of your money with me. But in the long term, if we have a good relationship, you will benefit from the benefits of the long-term cooperation. And so we have argued that this second-order fairness is certainly something you see in humans and probably in other species. When I describe it this way, it sounds very calculated and cold. We don't actually think people are doing, or primates are doing the calculation. We think it's an evolved propensity because it benefits you in the long run. We certainly see the first glimmerings of this in chimpanzees, and I suspect that we'll see it more broadly across these highly social, cooperative species, especially ones that perhaps have larger and more complex cognitive abilities and social lives. In humans, we can use our ability to plan for the future to, in fact, calculate it and understand it. I know that if I put this off now, in the long run, it will benefit me in these ways. And so I think the combination of language and our great ability to delay immediate gratification and also to plan for the future helps immensely. So just to summarize, I've thrown a lot of information at you. But I think that the main points are that by studying other species, we can in fact learn something about the human sense of morality. And first, it's just how some of these other behaviors evolved. So I just finished telling you how I think the sense of fairness might have evolved. Maybe it's right, maybe it's not, but it gives us a framework to start testing to help to better understand how these behaviors came into being and to help understand what features are going to be important. Is relationship quality important? What's the role of the differences in the different values that people are experiencing and so forth? Are there contexts when you would expect it to be very difficult for people to respond in a way that promotes fairness? For instance, if I'm advantaged, but I'm so over-advantaged that it's going to be really difficult for me to give it up because it's such a great benefit, I might be a whole lot less likely to do so. And of course, it tells us something about the specific selective pressures that led to this. So I think cooperation is very important, for instance, in the sense of fairness. Orangutans are really, really smart. If you do lab tests with them, they actually outperform chimpanzees on quite a number of lab tests. But in multiple studies now across multiple different labs and multiple groups of orangutans, we have no evidence at all that these guys care at all about equity. So it's not just a matter of being smart. It seems to be that they don't probably care about it because they have no reason to, because they really don't work together. They can. If you put them in captivity in situations of, where they can work together and gain rewards, they'll do it, but they don't spontaneously. And you can also look at some of these value things, as I said, the trade-off between current reward and future goals. And what's really missing at this point, and what I'm hoping to go into more next, is what are the mechanisms in development for of these behaviors? What are the roles of risk preferences? What are the roles of different abilities and delay of gratification and planning and so forth, both at a species level but also at the individual level? Some of this might help to explain why we're getting these individual differences within how subjects respond, even within the same set of species, so chimpanzees or whatnot. I also suspect that this response has a very strong emotional component. Emotion is a dirty word when you're talking about animals, although it's becoming less so. But I don't think that the animals are sitting down and calculating this. Let me see, Helen got a better reward than me, and I'm really upset about this, so I think I'm going to refuse. I think it's just a frustration response, the same as you'd see in humans. So understanding better how emotion plays a role in this and how emotion and cognition are tied together, because I don't think that they're discrete and separate, will be really informative. There's a big argument that non-human primates have empathy. They may well, and if so, this may play a role in it as well, particularly in the case of advantageous responses. Whether or not you think empathy is necessarily a good thing, it's not just that, oh, I feel empathy for you, so therefore I'm going to help you. Empathy could also mean, ooh, I understand you're going to be mad and I don't want to lose you, therefore I'm going to help you. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a positive, but having a sense of empathy would in fact promote that. And obviously in humans we see a huge role of impact of culture. So most human societies have a sense of fairness, but what that means varies dramatically based on the culture and the environment in which individuals grow up. That's probably true for the primates too, and it would give us a way to study it and also to look at the development. There aren't very many developmental studies in non-human primates because we don't, most of us don't have the option for breeding them. So anyway, this work takes an enormous amount of time and energy, so I'd like to thank all of my graduate students and research assistants and funding sources, and thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've got about 15 minutes before we formally close, but so I'll encourage you to wait for the microphone to reach you so your question can be recorded if you want.
Thank you very much for a very stimulating talk. I'd like to rewind right back to almost the very start,
Sure.
when you mentioned social norms. So I appreciate that you were mainly aiming to talk on a functional rather than mechanistic level, but to me as a psychologist, when you say that primates have social norms, you've made a very strongly mechanistic claim.
Yeah.
So if we see that behaviors tend to be regular, that could be because individuals have personal preferences that they just happen to share with other individuals, whereas social norms implies more than that. It implies, for example, that maybe you're performing an action because you believe that others expect it of you,
Right.
or because you believe that there's a principle involved that might trump some other strong motivations. you might have. So what's the evidence that makes you say that they actually have social norms? They have this sense of ought, which is what goes beyond individual preference, which is what we mean by social norm.
Right. So, and you're right, I am speaking functionally, especially for some of the species, what we see is consistent behavior. For some of the apes, we do start to see more tangential evidence that there might be more there. I would certainly never go out on a limb and say they have principle. And one argument against social norms is it's kind of hard to figure out how very strong social norms would come into existence without language. I mean, one of the reasons why we have social norms is because we can literally sit down in a room and say, we're starting a new collaboration. So what are going to be the rules and who's going to get authorship and so forth? And the primates can't do that. However, they also live in quite a bit smaller groups than us. And so one of the arguments is that it is possible that in their negotiations, they figure out what's expected in the group. So a juvenile growing up in the group may recognize that it's expected that, for instance, you don't steal food because you get punished when you do it. So it's I would argue that it's sort of a middle ground. It's not quite just, oh, okay, this is a regular pattern of behavior that they show, because they do seem to learn these behaviors across development, but I wouldn't say that it's a principle. So if we don't want to call it social norms, that's fine with me.
Thank you.
Back there, you pass the microphone back. Paul, could you pass the microphone?
Thank you. I missed the first part of your talk, so I must apologise. However, the part I did hear, you mentioned little, if anything, or one very brief mention on kin relation. I'd want to know much more about the nearness in terms of genetic relatedness of the individuals you were testing.
Great question.
And secondly, the concept of fairness includes how much energy you are costed in terms of the input into the action you enjoin with the other individual. For instance, in the pulley example, does a bigger, stronger individual, would that individual be expected to exert proportionately the same amount of energy, but in absolute terms, more energy, therefore, than the other individual? So in terms of fairness, you said nothing about who is expected to import what into the joint activity. Thank you.
Yeah, those are both great questions. So the first one is an easy one. None of our guys, so far as we know, were related as first or second degree relatives. So for the capuchin monkeys, we know that the matrilines are unrelated, and we test, all of our partnerships are tested across matriline. So it's possible that they could be cousins, but we don't believe that they're related. We have a few studies where we have actually looked specifically at mother-offspring pairs versus other pairings, and we do find exactly what you'd expect. That one study I mentioned with the dispersed versus the clumped food, the mother-offspring pairs showed the same pattern, but were overall much, much, much more likely to cooperate than the unrelated pairs. I didn't mention it, but the same thing was true in the study I mentioned with the apple and the grape. We tested unrelated pairs and related pairs, and interestingly, the related pairs also showed the same pattern. Overall, much more likely to cooperate, but they too, some of the related pairs showed had a fair distribution, if I can use that word, and some didn't, and the ones that didn't cooperated at a lower level. So clearly, kin biases should play an enormous role. I mean, both theory and experience tell us that, but every other study I mentioned in here, and in fact, for both of those studies, it was always unrelated individuals who were being tested. So it shouldn't have been driven by their relationship. The other question is a more interesting one. So I mentioned it briefly in the context of the food when I talked about how you can have a less preferred and a more preferred food, and still, my less preferred food is higher than your more preferred food or whatnot. We don't know what the relative preferences are for these guys, and we don't necessarily know how they see relative levels of effort. So yes, the alpha male is bigger and stronger, should be able to pull more. We know, because we've done pulling tests, that for these pulling trials, we've got capuchin monkeys. Capuchins weigh on average, I think the females are about 2.5 to 3.5 kilos. Males might get as much as 6 kilos. We have a female who can pull in 8 kilos. She's just really strong. So there's a huge variability in how much they pull. We haven't tried to control for that because it's difficult to see how we would. I wrote a paper with Redwanj Bashari a couple of years ago, who's an evolutionary biologist, and we thought a lot about when they should care about that. And it turns out that in most contexts of cooperation, they really shouldn't. So for instance, in mutualism, it doesn't matter if I have to work harder than you if I'm going to benefit, because I'm still doing more, I'm still getting more than I would have. It seems to make the most difference sort of on the margin where we're talking about these highly reciprocal sorts of things, or anything with anything where you're forming a reputation. That doesn't mean that it doesn't influence it, and we can't control for that. So in all of these studies, we didn't. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I really enjoyed the talk, and you talked so many different aspects of the behavior that you've tested for and so on, and it's very impressive techniques of experimentation. I just wanted to ask a technical question, just about, for example, the choice that the monkeys were faced with between a grape and a cucumber. And I know you'll take this the right way, that yourself and your graduate students who are feeding these things look a bit like monkeys.
Yeah.
Okay. What would happen if what was providing the cucumber or the grape wasn't something that looked like another monkey, and so their reactions are not going to affect the outcome as directly as it might?
Well, actually, it's funny because usually I get the question from the other way, which is, y'all aren't conspecifics. How could they possibly respond to you? I mean, you were nice enough not to say this, but not only do we look a lot like them, but we also control their environments. And there's a whole literature in animal behavior on how humans are inadvertently cueing all sorts of species. It turns out you can cue pretty much anything by either where we're looking or where the hands are being held or whatnot. Presumably that makes a difference in this. And it's actually more than just a practical importance, because one of the key questions is, are they responding to inequity because their partner's getting more than them? Or are they responding to the fact that the experimenter is giving their partner more than them? That's a very large difference. We actually tried to test this by running a study using a computerized paradigm where the subjects worked side by side and then they got rewarded differentially. And it didn't work. I'm going to veer a little bit into, oh, this is challenging. We set it up so that the rewards would come down the middle and spread out to each individual so that they could see them, and they made a lot of noise as they came down the tube, and they wouldn't use it. So we've got to, yeah, they can be picky. I think it scared them. So I haven't done that yet. We've got people who are working on that. I mean, one possibility is that if you're sitting there working on computer tasks, maybe they don't care. Now, whether that's because they don't care because there's not a human handing out the food, or because, frankly, they're used to working on computer tasks. I didn't tell you this. These guys are all computer trained, so they're used to doing computerized tasks with using a joystick to control a cursor. And we do a fair amount of work looking at prisoner's dilemma games, assurance games, hawk-dove games, and so forth, using a computerized modality where they share a joint computer screen. One of the other possibilities is...
Monkeys have a joystick?
Yeah. Yeah, they actually like it quite a lot. So one of the possibilities, too, would be that they're just so used to the fact that they're hearing lots of other individuals in the room getting fed at different times than them that they wouldn't notice. So it turns into a bit more of a complicated question. But it's something that several of us are actually working on quite hard. Actually, the people who work with bonobos are the most concerned about it, because bonobos tend to be extraordinarily human-oriented. So I was just talking with some researchers in Belgium who are trying to do this, and the apes were so focused on the human experimenters that they weren't really paying attention to what was going on, so they are computerizing it.
Okay, there's a famous cartoon about 50 years old with two rats in a cage, and one rat saying to the other, "Just watch this. I've got this guy conditioned to give me food every time I press this button."
There's a cartoon. I haven't seen that one, although if you have a copy of it, I would really like it. I've got the one from The Onion that's a chimpanzee writing up his long-term study of conditioning humans.
A couple of questions at the front here.
Yes, please.
Gentleman here.
I realize when you talk about
Could you wait until the microphone gets there? That's great. Thank you very much. Go and catch your question.
anything, I really appreciate that. When you talk about friendship, cooperation, equity, fairness, empathy, we were getting close to compassion. Did you notice any standard pattern in compassion?
So nobody's studying compassion right now, probably because we're all afraid we'd get kicked out of the scientific club if we did so. It's interesting, however, I happen to be writing, coincidentally happened to be writing a review paper on how primates respond to death with a colleague of mine. And there's a fair amount of evidence that they change their behavior around when an individual who's a part of their social group dies. So I think right now that's the closest we've got to evidence of compassion. Now, I realize it's a very different context, but there's no reason there couldn't be. I mean, these guys have, in the wild and in our groups, they live together for years. I mean, capuchin monkeys live 40 to 50 years. Chimpanzees can live 60. And so there's no reason why they shouldn't form very close relationships. So I wouldn't rule it out in principle. It's just we don't really have any data for it right now.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
First of all, thank you for your talk. A little anecdote. I remember that when I was a master student, I saw the video you just showed, and I said to myself, "Ooh, I want to do something like this in the future," and now I'm doing it. So
Excellent.
thank you. And my question. So I'm working on morality in children, and so I deal with prosociality, inequity, cooperation, and fairness. And these, to me, are already aspects of morality. So I don't clearly understand why you call them precursors of morality.
Fair enough. So we could also call them components or aspects of, if you wanted to. The precursors language really comes from the fairness study, because for a lot of these species, we aren't really seeing fairness per se. We're seeing how they respond when they're getting less than a partner, but as I mentioned very briefly, in every species we've tested, except for the chimpanzees, they don't seem to respond when they get more than a partner. So the precursor language really is based on that, where we don't exactly know what's driving it. Functionally, it looks a lot like fairness, but we don't know for sure, for instance, that capuchin monkeys have a sense of fairness. Maybe they have a strong sense of, you got more than me, and actually, I would argue that that should be widespread across the animal kingdom. So, I mean, I know there's evidence of it now in rats. I would expect evidence in mice. Any species that works together and cooperates should show it. It shouldn't be rare. But responding when you get more is more rare, and so I think that is definitely a precursor to fairness and not an aspect of fairness, because it's not necessarily the same thing. So that's where the language came from.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
A couple more further back. Would you pass the microphone back? Good. Yes, directly behind you.
Yes, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I have a question to the statistics. I mean, for example, for the experiment on the inequity experiment, where you had these different results, rewards with cucumber and grapes, the difference was, I mean, the rate of refusal was just 10% and 20%. And I mean, I'm just a bit I was surprised that these numbers were so low in difference to one another. I mean, like 5%, you always have, like in medical trials, you always have this 5%, so for whatever, like for medical, so 10% is not really a significant difference, and then 20% neither does seem a big ratio. And second, what was the statistic? I mean, how many monkeys were tested to yield this 10% and 20% results?
Yeah, so it depends. It varies across the studies. So we've had studies with as few as 5 subjects in them, and studies with as many as close to 30. So we just use a basic non-parametric statistic. We use the Friedman's test. We don't have to worry about whether or not we're oversampling, because all of our pairs are always mutually exclusive. So we have A paired with B and C paired with D and so forth. So with the exception of the one study I mentioned where we intentionally repaired everybody with everybody else, each individual is only present once in the sample. So the Friedman's test takes into account the repeated measures across the conditions. One of the reasons why it ends up being significant is actually because it's so highly consistent. So in every study I think we've run with capuchins, every individual shows the same pattern of response. I had a study with chimpanzees where we only had one individual who didn't show the same pattern of response, and she never refused in any condition. So we're getting a very high degree of consistency. So unlike medical studies where some individuals are responding more and some are responding less, and you've got a whole bunch of variability that has to be accounted for, the bars you saw were standard error bars, and they're actually relatively small. So it's a remarkably consistent response.
Thank you. I think we have one more question at the back. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting.
Thank you.
I'm wondering about the difference between studies like this one that are conducted under controlled environments, presumably you know, you all are taking care of these monkeys, they're seeing you every day, versus ones that are conducted in the wild. And I'm not a biologist, I'm a philosopher interested in compassion and morality, moral psychology. So this is very interesting to me, and I don't know too much about the empirics, but I'd love to hear how that changes results or changes the way that you all experiment.
So the short version is we have no idea because there aren't a whole lot of field studies that are done for various reasons. In some cases it's because it's rather difficult, and in other cases it's because there is a real danger in getting the animals too accustomed to humans because then they are vulnerable to poachers and to human tourists who don't understand that it's not appropriate to give bubble gum to a capuchin monkey or whatever, which happens quite a lot actually. However, capuchin monkeys are not endangered, which is beneficial, and they also are present in some areas that have no tourists around them. So we actually just got a grant last year, and we're doing some of this in the field. So we're having to adapt the paradigm quite a bit because obviously we can't go up and interact with them. But you can have them come and you can have them eat on food platforms. And so we have developed a feeder box where we can control using a remote control who can gain access to it and who gets what and so forth. So you can have them see one thing and get something else, or you can set up a cooperative condition where they have to be there together. And we're going to be using exactly the same apparatus in my 5 social groups in captivity, but also in the field. Erica van der Waal, who's a Swiss biologist, has done quite a lot of this with vervet monkeys in South Africa, and she's had remarkably good success in getting them to use feeder boxes and then looking at these sorts of cooperation and decision-making paradigms. And actually, her results tend to mirror very closely what you find in captivity, with the one big difference that you get a lot more influence on of relationship quality and so forth, because there are larger groups who, our monkeys are spending all their time together, but that's not always the case. So for instance, when I study orangutans, I'm studying them at the zoo. They're socially housed in wonderful conditions, but they're also part of the species survival plan. So they have been moved around a bit more than they would be in a normal social group. So hopefully in about 2 years, I'll have some great data on that and can answer that question better.
Well, that concludes our formal questions. Perhaps we've got a few minutes at the end.
I'd be happy to stick around.
People would perhaps got any more questions and come up and have a chat. But I do encourage you to look at the Reciprocity website for news of next term's talks when the list becomes finalised. But in the meantime, I wish you all a blessed Advent and Christmas, and I'd like to join me in thanking our speaker.